starting to come in, so hopefully you can hear me. Make sure you've got your volume on. We'll just give it a few moments for everyone to kind of log into the system. Exciting moment seeing the numbers go up, and yes, people are actually here. So if all the other presenters and panelists could just mute yourself, just so there's no interference, start there.
Sounds a bit funny.
Good, so we'll just give it a few more moments and then we'll begin, because as we know, we're mapping, there's a lot of content to cover in our session. You can see the numbers still going up, so we'll just another few seconds. Right, I shall begin, and then anyone that obviously logs on can just come in as we start. So welcome, I'm really pleased to be here this evening to talk to you on the first of our two-part webinar series on mapping. So this first session is an introduction to the art and science of mapping. So those of you that have been on some of my previous webinars will probably recognise me, but I'm Natalie Weir, England Development Officer. Today's session, Ian Cooper from SYO and Martin Bagness and WAROC are here, and they will be presenting a majority of the content. And we've also got some other experienced mapper panellists, including Rod, Terry and David. So they'll all be here to answer your questions as they come along. So I think just a few minutes on why we're all here, and I think there's a variety of audience today. So this is aimed at the complete beginner mapper to give them an overview and introduction, but I'm aware we've got lots of experienced mappers as well, because mapping is such a huge subject that there's always new things to learn. So whether you're here to learn more about maps, completely new, you know, wanting to put something back into the sport, thank you for being here. The map is arguably the most important element in orienteering, apart from your brain and your legs. And to quote something that Ian sent me, mapping is like a good book with several chapters. It's a lot of information for us to kind of selectively use, because mapping can include completely new areas, updates, a part or of an existing map, you know, only a few corrections or the whole lot, and it can be forest or urban. There's a lot of history to mapping. I mean, Ian, who'll be our first presenter, did his first professional map before I was even born. You know, and there's things like once the map was finalised, that was it for 5 years. But now with computers and the technology updates, it's easier to make changes and hopefully a lot easier to get new mappers involved and kind of engaged in learning in ways that don't require as much you know, hardship as it did in the olden days. So there's also a lot more, you know, things like being here tonight on a webinar. It's far easier to communicate with each other and share and learn, and there's a lot of information out there online. So as part of this series of webinars, we hope to be able to share and circulate even more resources to kind of help facilitate your learning and your experience and getting to grips with mapping. And one thing that I thought useful to mention is that different mappers have different styles, different ways of doing things. We're all individuals. There are obviously mapping standards, symbol keys and mapping specifications, but we all will use various softwares or slight different methodologies. So that's the good thing about kind of these opportunities to share, so we can all learn about ways that other people do it that we may not have thought about. So that's exciting. Just a few admin points before we crack on, that everything is being recorded and all the resources shared. They will be updated as usual post-webinars on our webinars webpage. And whilst all the attendees, you can't talk to me, which is a good job because there's quite a few of you, you can ask the questions in the chat box. And what I will do is attempt to facilitate them as we go along. If there are too many or some that we can't answer, what we will do is answer them afterwards. So don't worry if your question doesn't get asked, but do ask those things that come to mind as we're going along. Obviously, the second part is in a couple of weeks, but today we'll be going through. We thought we'd start with the methodology of updating existing maps, because that is something that a lot of people, will start with. And some of you may have seen the pre-course reading that was sent round, which was a couple of sway presentations. So you may or may not have had a chance to look at those, but that's good background reading to give you a few of the kind of insights into things like what makes a good map, mapping specification links and all that kind of thing. But we wanted this session to be a lot more practical. So if you can make sure you've got a pencil and paper, and I've also put potentially a drink, just in case you get a bit overloaded with mapping knowledge during this hour. But we will be going for about an hour, and then with a chance afterwards for some questions and answers. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first presenter, which is Ian Cooper from SYO, who will do us a session on the methodologies, kind of updating and some of those things you can start thinking about when you start getting enthusiastic about being a mapper. So hopefully Ian will take over the screen. And obviously, if all the other panelists perhaps want to minimise their webinars now that they've all said hello, and then they can come back up later and we can just look at Ian's pretty face and his session. So if the others can just turn themselves off and mute them. And
okay, right, this presentation is meant as a handout. I'm not going to go through everything in it. I'm going to try and pull out specific important stuff or interesting bits, but it's going to be an aide-memoire to you after this presentation.
I can't actually see your screen. I can't actually see your screen. Can anyone? Have you pressed it? That's it. Got you. Lovely job.
Okay.
Yeah.
You may only do parts of updating a map. You might update symbol specs. You might update a whole map. This thing I'm going through, this presentation, is really about updating a whole existing map. It's my approach. It's what works for me. Other people may do it differently. I know Martin does the survey in the field differently to the way I do it. The map is the most important thing in orienteering for me, and it's important to get it as right as you can. You'll never get it 100% right, but you should get it as good as you can. I've got to say the sway presentations that went out were excellent. They summarized pretty well some of the aspects of mapping. The first couple of pages is just about me, and that's just about what I've said. So updating an existing map, I think your club should know you're doing a map update. You should get the last map that was prepared, obviously, because that's like your reference point. And how old is that map? It may only be a year old, so it may only be about updating one or two things. It may be 10 years old, so it may be it will be a complete resurvey. Are you going to update the whole map or just part of it? And what's the event and what's the timetable? If it's a major event, you really need to be starting mapping 18 months before the event. When I did the Compass Walk map of Burbage, I started 18 months before the date of the event, because you need to be able to look at it a year before the event. And what software are you going to use, OCAD or Open Orienteering Mapper? And that's going to be covered in the second presentation. This is a key point in red. Getting the base map right is really key. You want to make sure all the separate bits of information you're going to use to compile the base map do fit together. If you make errors at this stage and you start surveying with a slightly inaccurate base map, then those problems will become magnified. Working on this at this stage will really pay off. Now, the first thing I always do is I always check and update the magnetic north if required. And I'll tell you, I looked at some maps yesterday and the magnetic north had not been updated between 1978 and 2011. Considering it's a sport where we use the compass quite a bit, that was quite remarkable. So just for people who know, you may know this, but magnetic north is moving and the speed of movement is speeding up. And in Sheffield currently, magnetic north is about 1 degree west of grid north. It will be about 1 degree east of grid north in about 12 years. So, and this picture here is actually from, I think, the middle of 2020, and this shows the line across the UK, which was 0 degrees, and it is slowly moving east. Now, what I'm currently doing is any map I'm updating, I'm making magnetic north 0 degrees, and then you don't have to rotate the map and change the legend or anything for the next 12 years, and nobody can navigate to 1 degree accuracy. And here's a map of Riverlyn. This is just an example. If you see the black lines sloping slightly to the left, they were magnetic north in 1997, I think. It didn't say. I updated it in 2011, and that's the brown lines pointing to the north, and the blue lines is grid north. So the angle between the blue lines and the brown lines is the magnetic declination. Now, if I was to update that map now, the brown line would be twisted, turned to the east, so it was parallel with the blue lines. But it's important to get your magnetic north right straight away. You should then get on to collecting the background maps that you're going to use. I use Google Air Photographs, Bing aerial photographs, LiDAR contours, either 1 meter or 2.5 meter, Forestry Commission maps, whatever you can get hold of. It's important to check the dates. Lots of these will have the dates on them, and you'll find that I looked at a street map yesterday. The aerial photograph was 2021, but the street view map was 2014. So you have to be careful at times in what you're using. There'll be a difference between Google and Bing, for example, in the dates the aerial photographs were taken. Make sure you know what map scale and contour interval you're going to use. Forest is typically 10,000 5-meter contours, urban 4,000 and 2.5 meter contours, but it depends on the event and the area. In terms of symbols, there is a spec. This is mainly the sort of the paths and roads network. On the left-hand side, you've got the forest symbols, ISM 2017-2. The -2 is because they updated it from 17 because there were 1 or 2 errors they found or things they wanted to correct. And the right-hand side is the sprint specification, which has only recently been issued. And you will see there are differences between them, particularly in the way paved footpaths or major footpaths are mapped for sprint specs. These are my Bibles. I keep them by my side all the time. Whenever I'm doing a map, you're constantly referring to them. Also within the specs, it does specify the color chart. The color chart in the software determines the hierarchy of the color printing. So when you print green over yellow, that's because in the color chart in the software, green is ranked higher than yellow. And often you can find maps where the color chart's been played around with if you're updating an existing map. So you should always just check the color chart as well. The symbols, you should check if there are any unusual symbols. It's if you've got a map that several mappers have been involved in over several years, you'll find that 1 or 2 unusual symbols might have been introduced. And if you're doing a map update, it's not possible to just click the map update button. You need to go through symbol by symbol on some of the unusual ones. Tends to be things like gates and footbridges, and uncrossable walls to make sure that they're to spec and they fit properly. I mentioned about the base map and background maps, and this is a map I'm just updating. Quite a few people will have run at Sandal Beechwood, which is on the left-hand side of these pictures. There is an extension I'm doing to the right-hand side, which is an old mining dump that they planted trees on. And in the top left-hand corner, you've got an old OS map. The right-hand corner, top right-hand corner, you've got the Bing map. Bottom left, Google map. The right-hand side, bottom right, is something I use, which is a grid reference finder to check the grid references and help me with georeferencing the map. Georeferencing is making sure all the sections of the base map are exactly aligned to the grid reference in the OS national grid. And then we now have LiDAR coming along, which is at the top left-hand side of this picture. This is a collection of 1 meter contour LiDAR, which are the purple lines, and then I have overlaid it with the 2.5 meter contour from the LiDAR contours, and that's what I'm using for this, the extension to this map. So you can see on the left-hand side, there's lots of noise. It's actually dead flat with no contours, but the hill on the right-hand side is a spoil heap with quite a few contours. As SYO, we are typically putting on all our maps what 3 words references for finishes or car parks or whatever, and the right-hand top picture is just the top of the hill and the what 3 words reference pipes every simple for that location, which we put those onto all our maps. And then at the bottom, I've then combined or shown a sample of my base map, which is like an overlay. On top, you've got the map drawing software, which is OCAD that I'm using, and then behind it are the various background maps, which you can either hide or call up as you need. On this picture, I've got the LiDAR contours showing behind, and you can see on the right-hand side of the picture, I've actually started to trace over the LiDAR contours with a brown line, which is the contour line in the OCAD software. I've also traced over the Google Maps to show the forested areas in green. And then I've started going out and surveying them. So if you looked at the map today, you will find some of those forest edges have got fences or ruined fences around them. Some have got vegetation boundaries, some have moved. The map slowly develops, but it's important to get all those reference documents correct behind your base document. If you get any error at all, then you start making errors in your base map, and they get magnified as you get out into the field. One thing you do have to deal with is contours on older maps pre-LiDAR have historically been developed from initially 10 meter contours on Ordnance Survey maps, and then 5 meter contours have been derived from those, and then individual mappers have gone out and found re-entrants or spurs or whatever and put them onto their own maps. When you bring LiDAR in, you'll often find that there's a difference between the LiDAR information and the contours on the old map, and you have to make a decision on what you're going to do about those differences. It may be you just have to go and look around them. And I was doing a map recently, a Winco bank, and I ended up with about 10 circles on the map where there were differences between the old map and the LiDAR contours, and those were specific areas I went and looked at the contours in to see whether the old map was correct in how the mapper had interpreted or whether the LiDAR was correct. Once you've got that, you're then on to field work. Now, it's important that when you're mapping an area, your club should have permission. I'm not talking about local parks or open access land, but on private land, you must get permission. You also want to get permission to know that an event is going to go ahead. We spent a lot of time a year or so ago mapping Mam Tor and the ridge there. but in the end, the Peak Commission, the Peak Board, did not give permission for access. So that map we can't use. It's one of the maps on the front page. You need to know in these areas what are no-go areas and what are no-go times, shooting, other events, what have you. Orienteering clubs also have a duty of care to their officials, and if we've got younger mappers below 18, you know, we should be conscious of that. A map I've been doing recently is in quite an isolated area, not a few social problems, and you know, I'm frankly quite careful about the times I go there. So I make sure people know when I'm going. Take your mobile phone, and then British Insurance, Orienteering have got an insurance policy against public liability insurance. Claims are rare, but mappers have got to be members of British Orienteering to have this protection. We're then on to the survey. Sorry, I'm going fast, so there's a lot to get through. Some of this Martin's going to repeat, so you'll have like a second trawl at it. What are you going to draw with when you go into the area? That base map that I got of Sandal Beat, I normally print paper copies off of that, color copies at larger scales. That map is at going to be at 7.5 thou. I'll print a map at 4 thou, and that's what I take into the field with colored pencils. Plastic back case, I'll take the old map, copy of just the LiDAR contours if I want to look at that detail. You take whatever you think might be useful to look at while you're there, just to check if there's anything you're not sure about. Check the weather. I cannot map if it's below 4 degrees. My hands are just too cold. So other people might be able to handle that, but I can't. And if it's raining, it's obviously a problem. I take my Garmin watch, although most people know that even on moorland, the plots from what Garmin watches, GPS plots, can be quite out. So I only use it as a guide to where I've been. I would not base any mapping on a GPS plot. Some people take a voice recorder with them. You should know your distance measurement, how many paces you take per 100 meters at all the different scales. Every time when I do a base map at 4,000, I write down the side what my double paces and distances are going to be for a 4,000 scale map. And it's useful to take a colored beanie. I don't know if anybody can see that I take this hat. The first map I did of Thorndon Park, I took my son Nick, he might be listening to this, who was 3 at the time, and I kept asking him to stand still so I could move off and take a bearing for triangulating a point, but he always followed me, so when I turned around he was behind me. Now I use a beanie and I stick it on the tree, but it's got to be a beanie you can see. And there's a lot of move now to using tablets in surveying. And that's one reason I was interested in these mapping webinars, is about this new technology. There's a Facebook page called Orienteering Mappers, I think it's called, and lots of those guys are using tablets in the field. I would find that quite difficult, but technology is changing so rapidly, who can tell where it's going to be in 4 or 5 years' time? The compass, key to have. When I started, they had sighting compasses. I never used one. I always used a base plate compass, and I've always found that useful. Just beware of magnetic attraction. I was mapping in South Africa, one of the first maps I did out there, and I could not get the triangulation right. And I was on a ridge, and I did a bit of research and found out it was made of magnetic rock. So that particular ridge, we had to be very careful how we did the mapping around that ridge. And just be careful when you're holding the compass. You do it's naval pancakes. Make sure you're holding it properly. Mapping, you've got to be quite accurate. When you're running, you're not that accurate holding your compass, but when you're mapping, be quite careful. And then on to the map itself. The symbols I mentioned earlier, the symbol size on the map will be quite a lot larger than the real size of the symbol on the ground. So often you're faced with a position of looking at relativity, not absolute accuracy because the symbols don't allow that, but making sure the relative positions of symbols are correct. Making sure the map's accurate. So making sure that you avoid unnecessary detail, which can be difficult to do. Competitor, what the competitor is interested in is consistency. He wants to be sure that the same sort of features are shown in one part of the map as another part of the map. The runnability, summer versus winter. And in the specs, the runnability, if it says fast run, that generally relates to M21 doing 4-minute Ks. But when you're mapping, I think this is the 4th bullet, you've also got to think about the W10s and the W75s, what their view of bits of the terrain will be. But you're doing the map really for a 21 standard level. And barriers are quite important, particularly on urban maps. You may have to generalize at times to avoid too much detail, and one of the SWAY documents was very much about generalization. Don't be afraid to have a different view to the previous mapper, but you've got to be consistent. I haven't put much in here on forest versus urban, but urban, the white on a forest map will tend to be replaced by the, in like percentage area on the total map, replaced by the olive green on urban maps, so the outer bounds. There's much smaller detail on urban maps, so you have to have much more attention where you're drawing the map to how the symbols fit together. Our forest map, it doesn't have to be absolutely accurate where slow run moves to walk or walk moves to fight, but on an urban map, the boundaries between different features need to be pretty accurate. When you're mapping, keep your eyes open. Look around all the time. It's easy to miss things. So you're like constantly doing a 180-degree view as you walk forward. And I always make sure I draw up the survey as soon as I get home. You'll find that when you're mapping, there are 3 or 4 areas that maybe you're a little bit uncertain about, but you've got a picture in your mind of how they look, and that fades over time. But if you get home, draw it up, and in your mind, you've got this image still there. And once you've drawn it, does it look like you remember when you surveyed it? It's not easy, especially at the beginning. I spoke to one of our newer, younger mappers and said, what did you find difficult when you started mapping? And it was this 4th bullet, knowing what to put on the map and what not to put on the map. He found doing the base map okay, but once he got out surveying, deciding what to put on the map was quite difficult. And you may need to revisit previously surveyed terrain. There's been times when I've gone out for 2 or 3 hours and I've come back and I've felt I've achieved nothing. And I've gone back to those areas, and the next day, everything clicks into place. And I don't know what the difference is, but some days it works, other days it doesn't. It's also difficult to map if you don't orienteer regularly. I think you need to have a view of how people are doing mapping, what developments there are in mapping, what sort of scales people are using, how features are being shown on the map. Once people stop orienteering, I think it's quite difficult to continue mapping. That's just the final point. And then at the back, I've just got of this presentation, I've just got a whole lot of references. The first one is to the IRF and BOF mapping resources, which will include the symbol specs, magnetic declination information, the grid reference finder that I showed earlier on base maps, how to do georeferencing from the BOF website, a document I found about how to download LiDAR from the UK Environment Agency website. People won't be able to do that unless they've got OCAD, 10 and upwards, I think it is. And then documents about OCAD and Open Orienteering Mapper. And a couple of other useful links. There's a lot of information on YouTube. It's amazing how much is on YouTube. OMAP World of O has got a lot of maps around the world that you can look at. a lot of information out there that you can use.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Ian, that a lot of the stuff on base maps, LiDAR and the softwares will obviously be covered in more detail in session 2 as well. So obviously we'll share all these resources in the PowerPoints after this session, but it works, it's quite complementary with the second session as well. So that was a really good run through, and I think that sets a good kind of start point for Martin now to take over with some more kind of top tips and more practical exercises for us all to take part in. So thanks a lot for that, Ian. There are a few questions that came in, but I think what I'll do is leave them till the end because there are a couple of some of them are quite general. So what I'll do is switch over to Martin. He's hopefully ready with his bits and bobs.
Right, I hope you can all see me.
Yeah, we can see you, and we've just got the go-to webinar page on the screen.
Ugly mug up. Right. Yeah, thanks very much, Ian. That was brilliant, and I think I agree with pretty much everything, even some of the top tips. I've never tried the one with the coloured beanie, but I will do. Right, my internet's been playing up, so it doesn't do it again. I was offline just now for about 10 minutes. If it suddenly goes blank, if I disappear, then we'll have to fill in somehow. Try and get back online if it happens. Right, what I've got is I've got 4 examples of very recent jobs I've done.
You've just got the go-to webinar page up on your screen so far, Martin. Is there something else we were meant to have out?
Yes. No, I haven't put them up yet. It's all right.
Oh, cool. Sorry.
I'm going to show 4 examples of very recent jobs in sort of progressing order of difficulty, and I'm going to intersperse them with my 10 top tips, plus a few little quizzes and drawing exercises. So you'll need a pencil and paper or pen and paper ready. Right, I hope everyone can see that map. Have you got that, Natalie? Or
yeah, all good.
Screen,
top tip number 1. Yeah.
Right. My presentation is on OCAD because, well, it's sort of relevant and it's the only thing I know how to use. Right, straight into top tip number 1, which is that repeats of what Ian said, I'm afraid, but time spent on preparing a base map is a real investment, and if you don't stint on the base map, you could save yourself hours of work. If you try and cut corners with a base map, you might spend another 10 hours in the forest in the rain and being bitten by midges or something. Right, I thought first of all just give a few examples of different kinds of base maps just to bulk out what Ian said. My first one is the OS, and I hope you can see that. That's the street plan, which only covers urban areas, and it's typically 1,250, 2,500. It's a really good base map if you can get hold of it. It's expensive to buy, but a lot of clubs have someone in the council or the local university who can get hold of it. So don't go out with a blank piece of paper. If you're mapping your local park, try and find someone who can get you one of these. Right. Next base map, OS 1 to 10,000 to 25,000. If you look at those 2 maps, it's a local wood I mapped years ago on the OS. It's pretty bad, actually. It's what all maps were sort of based on in the 70s. What you could try and do as a little exercise is transfer that 3 control course from the OS base onto the orienteering map. Likewise, see if you can see where the course on the orienteering map is on the OS base, just to give you an idea of what is on and what isn't. I'll just give you a few seconds, everyone, to have a look. Right. I've made my mouse cursor enormous, so I hope you can see it. Where it is on the orienteering map is number 1. So that track isn't really there anymore. Number 2 will be there on the end of that hill, which is there. Number 3 is on the ditch. That's on the base map, that's okay. And then these contour features on the OS map, they're just not there really, except for that one roughly there. So I try and avoid using OS as a base map. We move on. Right. So PG plots, photogrammetric plots, made from a stereo pair of air photos by 1 or 2 skilled operators. Quite hard to get hold of now, but they're how almost all maps in the sort of 80s, 90s, noughties were made. Great on the open moorland because they're done from air photos, or open heathland, parks, because you can see the ground. Not very good at all in woodland. And these examples are Bishop's Wood, lovely Lake District bluebell wood. As you can see, the contours aren't a huge amount of help, and this was a difficult, time-consuming job, like any sort of woodland was pre-LiDAR. Ian's mentioned LiDAR a bit. It's mostly going to be a sort of topic for next week, next session. I have just put in a bit just to show how mapping has changed in woodland areas. Suddenly, in the last 5 years, we've got fantastic base maps. And one of the problems of working on a PG plot was you never quite knew what you'd done was right, because you just couldn't check it when you'd done it. I never thought anyone would be able to tell if it was right. And then along came LiDAR, and you can see all your mistakes. I'm actually quite happy comparing that with the LiDAR. I think quite surprisingly complete and accurate, and the shapes are pretty similar. So then again, as a little exercise, can you put those 4 control sites onto the PG plot and onto the LiDAR? I'll give you seconds and I'll put them on myself. So right, on the PG plot, it's pretty hard, I think. The entrance there, the Crags, we're in there probably. That knolls must be about there somewhere. That re-entrant, about there, I think. So not much use, PG plot. LiDAR, brilliant. Yeah, there's that re-entrant. Crag, I think, is about there. No, it's actually on the base map. Re-entrant, perfect. So LiDAR's brilliant. All worth getting hold of. Right. Moving on to topic number 2. I think Ian has gone over this. I'll re-emphasize it. There's no point mapping unless you know what a good map looks like. You have to have a picture in your mind of your ideal map for that area. Otherwise, you'll never achieve it if you don't know what it is really to start with. And I'd say the only way to get that knowledge is to use maps as much as possible when you're not actually racing. So if you're planning, controlling, coaching, that's a really good way of looking at maps, getting used to them. If you're racing, you're sort of rushing along and you don't take much in. And as a really good exercise before you start mapping, I think it's good to just go on a map walk, find a map that you like, go out, just walk around, have a critical look at everything. Are there some mistakes on it? Why is it a good map? Why do you like running on it? Number 3, don't try and reinvent the wheel, just get people to help you with every stage. You don't fancy the technicalities of making a base map, ask someone to do it for you. Right, top tip number 4, exactly what Ian said, I'm afraid. Yeah, know the symbol sheet. You can see that it's like a load of litigation, really. Woe betide anyone who tweaks with the symbols at all. You'll have a visit from the Iowa enforcement team. Right, I've got a little quiz here just to test everyone's iOS symbol knowledge, and I'll give you 20 seconds just to have a quick look at those, see how good you really are. Right, first question, which of these is an erosion gully? It's sort of choose a bit of a fire of the specifications. I'll try and use contours if I can. I don't know why there's one that looks just like an index contour. It seems a bit silly to me. Number 2, which of these is a platform? You may all have said the little triangle. If so, you're wrong. It's none of those is a platform. The black triangle is a significant landform feature. The black circle is a significant man-made feature. So that may well be a platform if it's visibly man-made, like Lake District ones. The other 2 symbols are upside down pits and depressions. I don't know if anyone's got the boy band, but those green stripes with the dark green is run in one direction. And we've got cultivated land, scattered trees, and undergrowth slow running. Right, I'm going to move on to some little examples of very recent jobs. I'll zoom out again. I had an emergency call out at the weekend. That's my car, by the way. You have to have one of those if you're a mapper. So the phone rang, and within 5 minutes I was out, lights flashing, bells going, and I had to map Cartmel Village Hall and school playground. A very small, easy job. I think it's as easy as it gets. And I think it'd be a really good sort of project to start on. I'd recommend anyone having a go at something like this. I think probably they could have got the primary school children to do it themselves, actually. So it's updating the old map, 2004 old map. Got a few printouts, went out with a couple of coloured biros. And then you just have to walk around and use observation. And you walk around, look at everything very carefully. It's dead easy to walk past something. If you compare the 2 maps, the building's changed a lot. There's other buildings being demolished. The playground's been redrawn. I had to decide how much to show, and there was so little that I showed absolutely everything, including metal grain covers and lines on the netball court. So that's, yeah, good first project. Right, this is quite a major top tip. When you're mapping, make your notes on the base map, on a map board, in map form and to scale. So I would never recommend just writing down a long list of bearings and numbers. Never recommend just taking photos and nothing else. Really, what you've got on your map board at the end of the day should be something you could just about orienteer on. Right. Next, slightly harder job. This was a few weeks ago. Updating a fairly good old map of a forest area. Again, I think really good first project for anyone. I just put on my own kit, jogged around the area with some coloured biros, a couple of printouts. Deer fence wasn't there. It was a new track. Bit of vegetation change, bit of held area down the southeast. So really good starting point. Yeah. Right. We're on to number 6 already. Another quite important one. It's a waste of time updating a map that's just never been very good. It's probably about time to just spin it and start again. I know for a fact an awful lot of maps date back to the 70s, and they were probably inaccurate then, and they've just got worse with a sort of Chinese whispers process of error on error on error. When I have thrown away a map and started again with LiDAR, I've never regretted it. So if you're going to spend time on your first mapping project and it's updating an old map, just make sure, have a chat to people in the club, make sure it's worth actually doing. You might want to make it a more ambitious project and just start again. Take your map out with you, have a look at it. Don't forget the features, but spin it basically. Or make sure you're just not correcting someone else's mistakes, because that's a bit of a nightmare. Right. Another top tip, every first-time mapper, myself included, you just try and update everything you see, and that's wrong, really. Everyone does it, and you'll probably do it and done it. So you have to set criteria and be very disciplined in sticking to them. It's very easy to start mapping slightly below your criteria, and then you go a bit below that, and you go a bit below that, and you end up mapping pebbles rather than boulders. You just have to remember that you're mapping for orienteers, you're not mapping for yourself, you're not trying to make your own lovely picture of the forest with all these lovely little things you found. If you found something lovely and it shouldn't be on an orienteering map, you just have to leave it off, really. Right. A little bit more about clarity in the cartography stage, the drawing stage. This is a map I made for LOK last week. It's fairly typical of a lot of maps in that there's parallel features. So, 4 or 5 parallel features running very close together parallel. As a mapper, you're quite entitled to just only show the significant ones. It's not very good to space everything out like this middle section, because you end up being inaccurate. The edge of the field sort of moved about 30 meters. Just show the important ones. Right, when you're drawing, I do try and avoid stripes, because undergrade stripes, they really confuse the eye. It's hard to see what the contours are doing underneath. You can get away with a solid screen to do that, and dots are quite bad as well. And just use a bit of mapper's license. Don't draw a contour right over a path, for example. Features shouldn't be on top of each other. So next example, this is just slightly harder, and this was last week in London again for LOK. This is mapping an easy-ish forest and open area, but from scratch. So it's a brand new map of a brand new area. So just like Ian, I've got my LiDAR, got my photo. I like to draw the two together. So you can see I've taken green lines off the air photo, just drawn them on to show the edges of vegetation. The field work, I was umming and ahhing whether to go for biro technique, and I did. I sort of regretted it because it turned out to be more detailed than I thought. So it was a bit fiddly fitting it in. And the final map on the left, and there's 3 controls, 3 control circles. So see if you can fit them onto the field notes and the base map. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So the base map, if you can through my mess. That's the track junction. That's the boulder. That's the tree. On the base map, I think track junction was there. Interestingly, huge tracks didn't show up on the base map. It doesn't matter because you've got some other things. The boulder did show up on the base map. That tree is not actually on the base map, but these three to the northwest are. So I'm sure you all got this right.
Interesting question from Tim Martin that's come in, and he asks, why are crags almost always placed on contour lines?
It's partly mapping style. It's considered to be a bit naff in mapping circles to have them floating in the middle of nowhere. It's also because if you're mapping crags that are a reasonable size, they do just tend to fall on contour lines, because I only map crags that are head height really, and a form line is 2.5 metre contour, so there's a very good chance it is going to be on a contour line. I think that's the reason why, but floating contours, a bit naff, not very fashionable. I hope that's answered it.
Thank you. Yeah, and there's also some useful bits on those sway presentations about form lines and things like that as well, so people can go back to that and have a gander. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks, Natalie. Right. I'm going to say a little bit about the actual techniques of surveying, sort of the nitty-gritty of it. Well, map making is a strange mixture of science and art. The science side is just measurement. It's quite objective. You're just trying to put things in the right place. The artistic side is perhaps the harder bit. It's subjective, it's personal. And at some stage, there's no getting around it. You'll have to draw something using your hand, however you do it. And that's no different to drawing in a life class or drawing a vase of flowers. You have to look very carefully, form a picture in your brain, then your hand and your eye has to draw that picture on a piece of paper. So, little exercises here. If you'd like to have a go, get your scrap paper and pen or pencil ready. I'll give everyone 20 seconds to draw number one, looking at it all the time, referring to it, starting now. Ten seconds. Okay, I'm sure you're all brilliant there. The second one, I'm going to let everyone look at it for 20 seconds, and then I'm going to take it off the screen and then start drawing it. So don't start drawing it till it's gone. So starting now, form a mental picture which you'll later draw. Okay, it's going. Right, it's gone. So start drawing. Right, it's coming back again. There we go. So I hope that was all right. Finally, 20 seconds to draw that, and you can have a look at it at the same time. Okay. Right, I've had a go myself. Something I did earlier somewhere. Something like that. Anything roughly like that, sorry. Right, I'm just going to repeat the exercise with some contoury things. So, how about 10 seconds to draw that looking at it? Okay. 10 seconds to look at it, and then it'll disappear, and then draw it. Now. Right, it's going. Gone. And finally, try and map that, and you've got 20 seconds. Right, I'm sure there's some masterpieces out there. Might look something like that one on the right. Right. Now a bit more on the science side of mapping. How do you actually measure things? Well, if you've got quite a bad base map, you have to plot things out. It's best to take a load of short bearings, cross bearings, and pace count. I've called it the Captain Cook method because that's exactly how Captain Cook mapped off of Australia and the coast of New Zealand. It's quite tedious, as Captain probably found out. Don't do anything in more than a 50-meter sort of bearing or pace. You can't see much further than that in the woods, and pacing sort of gets a bit inaccurate after that. So I just try and work in from the edges of the area, in and out from fixed points. By then you have a set of fixed points, sort of 50 meters into the forest. You can come back more in the center of the block, referring to the features you mapped earlier. If you're taking a bearing when you're mapping, it's the exact opposite of taking a bearing when you're orienteering. If you do use a base plate compass when you're racing, it's the same sort of 3 or 4 step process, but exactly in reverse. And I think we'll try and get something online just to explain that in a bit more detail. And it is very time consuming. It's quite hard to get it right doing it that way. It's best to get a better base map, really. If you have a good base map, you can just sort of orienteer around on it. You're taking as much off as you're adding on. You usually know where to draw everything, and you can do a lot of it by eye. As a sort of handy hint, every line you draw on the map, draw it very faintly to start with, because you probably more than likely change it when you walk around to the other side and have another look. Only when you're sure, do it firmly. And then GPS, I agree with Ian, it does take a long time and it's not always that accurate. Mapping onto a tablet, I don't tend to get on very well with that sort of thing, and to me it just adds another whole level of things to worry about. But yeah, go for it if you like that sort of thing, go for it. Should you import digital data, e.g. LiDAR contours, straight into the final map file? I never would, because you spend so much time editing them and it makes a real mess of the file. You might as well just draw them from scratch and it's twice as quick. Right. Final mapping project. Just for completeness, this is a much more sort of complex area, Lake District area, intricate contours and so on. I definitely wouldn't use the paper and biro technique. I'd take out grafting film, I think we can see that, and very hard pencil, like got one here, P8 with a rubber. Over the top of the base map on a board, seal it with waterproof paper, waterproof tape, and it's sort of bomb-proof. It'll resist any weather conditions. If you get caught in a shower, it's all right, and your work doesn't wash off. Probably the major benefit of plastic drafting film is you can just rub things out and draw them again and again, and you can draw very fine lines indeed if you want. This sort of seems a bit advanced, but if you have a good base map, I don't think it's too hard really. So I'm going to put it in this first session, even though there'll be a lot more on LiDAR in the second session. So the map on the left is the LiDAR contours. They're at 1 meter. The purple ones are at 5 meters. As the photo, the same area in the middle, I've put the two together and made this base map on the right, number 3. I've taken off the edges of the trees and the edges of the marsh, which are very clear on the photo. And this is a brilliant base map. It's something I wouldn't have dreamt of 5 years ago. Quite good fun to map on, really. Final maps above. So looking at that circle, and you place that boulder on the LiDAR photo base map. You can actually see it on the photo, it's there. I'm sure everyone got that. So I'll put it on the base map. It's not on the LiDAR. Not surprisingly, it's about there anyway. I'm not going to say a lot about LiDAR, but you do have to change the contours an awful lot. If you copy them right onto the file map, it won't give a very good picture at all. The LiDAR contours, 5 meter contours, 2.5 meters, 4 lines are on the right. My mapped version is on the left. I've used an awful lot of mapper's license, shown the extent of each knoll, because they do come right out, the width of the gaps between the knolls. I've taken this contour right up to the edge of the marsh to show the break of slope at the edge of the marsh. And I've put the contour around each knoll, the very base of the knoll, because that's how you see it when you're running. That's what counts. Right. So there's the base map on the map board. I've gone a bit over the top with the weatherproofing, but it's in the Lake District, so you never know when it's going to grow. Number 5, that's the field notes. Number 6, final map again. I totally agree with Ian. As soon as you've got home, draw it up, because there's always a few things you can't remember, and they're fresh in your mind. Right, the end. Top to number 8. Yeah, when you're drawing up in the software, which will be explained more next week, scan your field work. What I do is I just slap this Number 5, straight onto the flatbed scanner, get a high resolution scan. It opens as a background map in OCAD, and then just completely redraw it using OCAD symbols. Don't try and use a digitizing tablet, you're just sort of using guesswork then. Right, top tip number 9. Yeah, just go out and try mapping, give it a go. Don't be put off because only map to professional and you think you have to do a professional job. My maps were rubbish for years, I'm sure. Perhaps they still are. Don't stress over what you produce. And just aim to progress in easy stages, I think. I've always hated homework, but here's a little bit of homework if people fancy it before the next session. Just go and have a try of mapping a little local park or somewhere easy. And if you don't fancy that, try the map walk exercise. Get a map that you really like when you're orienteering and go out and have a good hard look at it. Final top tip. Make sure you enjoy it. I think it's a good way of becoming mindful. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm pretty sure it's very absorbing anyway. It's the best possible technique training for orienteering itself. It gets you out in the woods, and it's, if you like creative things, it's like that. It's you can look at what you've done and you think, yeah, I've made that. That's rewarding. And then you might even win an award one day. Right. That's the end of my...
It takes 50 years, does it, for us to send you a certificate? That's a bit rubbish. I should look into that. There's a few quick questions I'll put to you, Martin, and then if the other panellists could be ready and raring, there's a couple of questions that I think some of the others will be helpful on. So if anyone in this last kind of 5-10 minutes, if you've got any burning questions, inquiries, thoughts, type them out to me. And we'll put them to the panellists while we've got them here. So the first quick one for you, Martin, is just Christopher has asked, what is a floating contour, please?
I don't know, actually. I've never heard that term before.
Interesting. Does anybody else on the panel know? Is it even a thing?
I think it's when it's raining and your lines wash off your mapping board and they float away.
Say that again, David. They wash away.
No, you got me stumped there.
Okay. Maybe it isn't even a thing then. All right. So just a couple of questions. If we can bring on the other panellists back in. But yes. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Ian. I especially like the drawing elements. That was getting the creativity flowing. There's a couple of questions which I always love, and I've had plenty of them over the last few months, and that's things to do with, and I know Terry loves these kind of questions as well, to do with copyright and licensing and stuff. So, for example, are there any license conditions, this is from Matthew, are there any license conditions associated with using Google or Bing mapping? And are there any implications for copyright? Or is that just free to use?
This is one we're actually trying to do some work on at the moment. When you have a look on these websites, although you might think they're free of copyright, there are often little messages tucked away in the bottom with people reserving copyright on them. I think the guidance really is to be mindful of that, and one of the jobs we're looking into is trying to look at some of the common sources that people would use and get specific answers on the copyright issue, which we hope to share with people in due course.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, Terry is currently chair of the mapping group. So hopefully we'll be able to advise on that in a bit more detail, but it is a tricky one. And there's a similar kind of question in reference to Google Earth. So the question is, can you use Google Earth for example, for school maps that aren't being used for events? And should the copyright be credited?
Well, I think the short answer is if people are claiming copyright, then you should at least credit them and probably check that they're comfortable making use of it. School grounds, many areas, the school itself will have a very detailed survey map of their grounds, and you may well find that that's the best source of information for a base map.
And then John's kindly come in and said that it may be because Martin said floating contour when they think he meant floating crag. I don't know if that makes any more. That makes
Possibly, yeah.
Floating crag. Okay, thanks, John, for that. And this is I'm just going to put in a fun question. Where is it? Where's this good question that came in? Well, I'm getting so many questions in now, I can't find it. Hang on, let me find it. Oh, there's loads of people coming in and said he meant floating crags. So there you go. Live with the tongue. What's the strangest thing you've ever had to map on a map? That's from Craig. Or you've chosen to put on a map. Anything that springs to mind?
I've made up things before, but fill gaps.
Nothing overly exciting then, Rod's looking like there's nothing.
No, I don't think I've got anything to offer.
Okay.
Nothing I'm admitting to anyway.
And there's a few questions in that ask about some of the strengths when it comes to OCAD and OOM, Orienteering Mapper, which we will go through in more detail in that second session, because we'll do a comparison kind of the strengths and weaknesses and costs and some of the functions. Martin has asked whether we can take the opportunity to ask you all while you're here watching us what package you use and have access to. So if you're coming on webinar 2 and you're still here these last 5 minutes, can you put in the chat box or the question box, doesn't matter, what software you use if you currently use some, if you use a package. This will help them in their planning for webinar 2. So if you're still there, start firing those in. And let me just have another quick look to see if there's any. Oh, I've got lots of OCADs now coming in. Yeah, well, I think that's it for the hot topic questions I can see that are relevant to this session. And then hopefully some of those other questions that have come in will be covered in detail for us in a fortnight's time. So that only leaves me to just thank firstly the presenters and the panelists for being here and taking part and providing so much knowledge and experience, and hopefully it's been useful for you all. Thank you all for coming and watching us. Hopefully you'll join us again in a couple of weeks. My colleague Rick will be facilitating that one, because unfortunately I'm off now on maternity leave. I shall miss doing all these webinars and hopefully see you in about a year's time, and hopefully things will have had lots more mapping sessions in between. So thanks once again for everyone joining us. This will all be shared, as I said, on the webinars webpage, hopefully by the end of this week. So thanks everyone, thanks all. Keep firing in those software you use, and that'll be helpful for this session too. Cool.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Good
Thanks, Natalie.
Good luck.
Bye.
Bye.
Can't get out. That's it.
The only reason I'm not cutting it off now is because people are still firing in their what software they use. So I'll leave it open for a moment before I switch it off.